Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this Mobile Ecosystem Forum webinar on platform regulation. I'm Serafino Abate, I'm a regulatory advisor to the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, and I have organized a similar webinar this year on different regulatory topics. And we thought with Dario, the chair, would be useful to have one taking stock of all the discussion that has been going on in Europe, particularly around the regulation of digital platforms, which in a way or another is likely to impact the mobile ecosystem and its players, and more generally digital markets. And therefore, I think is an interesting one to always keep an eye and spot opportunities to change the course of public policy. So there is a Q&A function as well, and I would encourage you to sort of like send through questions. The theme is quite wide in itself, so I aim today to provide about 20 minutes an overview of the different areas and the stream of works that have been going on. But I think without going too much into the details of any individual one apart from one case, so I think I strongly encourage everybody to just ask questions relating to specific points, so we can use that as a cue to have a bit of a extended discussion after the presentation. So I'm gonna start sharing my, I can see about 10 people now. So welcome again. At this point, I think I will start. So I'll share my screen. So platform regulation. By platform regulation, what I mean is the different streams in public policy that have been going on for since roughly 2016 now. We've seen competition authorities, we've seen the GDPR, regulating the access and use of personal data. We've seen different things, and now I think this year particularly with the new commission, Commissioner Vestager, Commissioner Breton, responsible for the single market, they've already published some key documents about their intention to, within the next couple of years, look at what type of rules can help the market expand, and also address some of the concerns of different stakeholders around digital platforms. So the debate, as I said, so there is the role of GDPR until now. Much of the focus since the debate in the early days, I think, has been on the relationship between market power of particularly some platforms and the use and collection of personal data. Then the GDPR came into force, and so we kind of like paused to see what happens with the GDPR, whether there is going to be enough. And we had some competition policy cases at national level, like the Facebook one in Germany. But the GDPR, we've seen recently this year, I think in July, there was a publication of the first report by the Commission that looked at the implementation of the GDPR. It's fair to say there's been a paucity of data protection authorities cases, particularly in terms of setting important precedent, and I think the fines that they can impose are still very small in comparison to what you would need to sort of like incentivize changing behavior. So I think we're going to see more of those, but I think there is also maybe a structural issue in the way data protection authority work. Then we have seen, as I said, in the early days, a lot of discussion around whether competition policy is enough to deal with digital market power. And we have seen, like in Germany, cases where the authority have been trying to use competition powers to protect consumers, in effect, from abuse of dominance. in the collection of data. So very specific case, and I'll talk about that in a minute because I think it's quite an important early one. And finally, we have seen lots of now national initiatives. So it's not only Brussels that is looking at this. We've seen reviews by the CDMA and by the government in UK. We have seen a digital review. We have seen in Germany, even a change of some competition rules in France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and so forth. So quite a lot of countries are already actively looking into these issues. The German case by the Bundeskartellamt, the competition authority, it's quite an interesting one because it's the first case of its kind where the authority tried to impose a fine on Facebook and ask them to desist in the collection of data unless they can get a more positive, what they call in effect, a stronger consent. The first case where market power is trying to establish a link, a legal link to competition, to consumer abuse. I think there is some specificity about this case in that in the German law there is a special, if you want, responsibility which is associated with being a non firm, and there is in particularly to kind of like consumers and have a special care of your customers, and this is quite unique at the moment of the German. But also interesting because it kind of like overlaps with the GDPR because it tries to do consumer protection, but in effect with different tools. Since then, first the case was overturned in a regional court in June 2019 in favor of Facebook. And then in July 2020, the German Supreme Court ruled, overturning again, and now ruled in favor of the regulator, the Bundeskartellamt. In pretty much all accounts, he said that basically what they established, the harm they established is correct, and the causality is also correct. And this can also now be appealed, so we might not see the last one. But what is also important about this is that this type of cases are extremely difficult. This is very specific to the German, to some extent, legislation. They are complex and involve very difficult trade-off. The general courts, which are used to deal with, especially regional one with, land cases, or, but also a sector where the expertise, third-party certification is more widely available. I think there is a serious difficulty and question mark whether these type of cases are actually the right way forward. So what is happening now and what is coming next? I think it has to be said that now we are probably, 2-3 years down the line, the general understanding of what digital platforms, how they work, is much improved. It's clear, for example, also now policymakers, that we are talking of very different companies, in most cases with very, very different business models, and this calls probably for different approaches and the use of different instruments. And this is what is happening kind of now, and I think is what we will see more and more in the future. Not everywhere we're going to see blanket regulation. In some cases, I think like now we are seeing some competition inquiries looking into the vertical integration and self-preferencing, the cases on Apple, which has brought forward by other music providers like Spotify. There's an inquiry into Amazon about self-preferencing his own products. But these are, generally speaking, I think, quite are similar to. There is a review pushed by Vestager, um, where we have seen, in effect, potentially they're going to have new competition tools, the DG competition in Brussels, much wider market inquiry tools. So in effect, they can decide on their own initiative to conduct an investigation and ask information into particular sectors, and also powers to become get a better understanding, well, be able in effect to look into digital mergers, which is a part of development of the last 5-6 years that I think authorities have been focusing on as well. And then there is on a different level something which looks at whether there should be ex ante regulation, so regulation that we attach to some market power platforms, some form of market power, but that is in effect horizontal and applies to different players potentially as well. We have the Digital Services Act initiative, which is championed by Commissioner Breton, which is looking at potentially providing some form of access to data, whether content moderation and regulation on some platform, consumer protection, and in some cases there is discussion around whether new types of market power definitions should be devised for certain digital platforms, because of recognizing a specificity in the way they operate, but also the impact they have on the wider, not only on the internet and digital markets. So this is happening. I think all these initiatives are meant to, bear some proposal before the end of this year. I think at this point it's quite difficult. We are realistically looking into the beginning of next year. Some proposals, some further consultation, but in effect, I think with everything has been going on with the COVID pandemic, rightly so, I think some dossiers have taken slightly a bit, backseat, and I think so. We'll see something coming out. What this something will look like, I think now, realistically, the way things are working, there is a lot more, just by virtue of having all these open debates about public policy around platforms, I think is making things clearer for everybody. There is a lot better understanding of how I can measure benefits, what the impact on consumers as well. So I think where you have greater transparency, you can rely on co-regulation and self-regulation a bit more. And I think these also make the job of regulator a bit simpler, because there is an asymmetry of information between the regulator and the regulated at the moment, potentially. Some rules around content moderation, similar to those, but I'm not an expert in the area, but I think it's quite clear that something will be done on that. And finally, on data access, with probably initially privately led initiative around open data access. We are seeing some initiative around that. But I think I'll be surprised if the Commission and General Authority don't start at least to put in place kind of backstop powers in case, emergency breaks in things, in case things don't work out in terms of self-regulation, they're able to intervene. So this is where we are with the different initiative. before concluding, I think it's important also to today I just wanted to talk about focus on Europe, because I think is where the debate has been more advanced, and also being a quite big economic area, rules that are placed in Europe usually then become an important reference in other parts of the world. We've seen that with the GDPR lately, but also in the past with telecom regulation and other type of consumer protection. But what is happening in Europe is part of a wider context and a broader trend into how we should treat, how in effect public institutions and authorities should retain control over digital markets and digital players in a way that they can ensure achievement of public policy goals, or to protect consumers effectively. I think the markets are doing a good job at that, but it's also clear, I think, that some regulation is needed, and sometimes simply because it's just the coordination required, otherwise it's not going to happen. There are some incentives to be sort of like aligned. So I think it's becoming a kind of like a dialogue, more of an open dialogue about the shape of regulation, where everybody, I think, is bringing something to the table. But I think it's quite clear that we're going in that direction. Certainly in Europe and the US, less clear. And I think, again, after the election, there's a big gap in terms of what could happen depending on the administration that comes into place. But there have been a lot of discussions there. There's been some very important academic and sort of like intellectual contribution to the debate. Australia has been doing a lot of work, also the BRICS economy. So everybody has been looking into this, and I think this has put a lot of the spotlight, especially on some of the biggest platforms that operate globally. So with that, I kind of like concluded with the sort of bit that I wanted to bring to the attention, just in terms of what is happening. So I can see that there are some. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and look at the Q&A, where we have some questions. Which I'm very happy to start taking the question. So start with the first question. What was the response from Facebook to German regulation? Did they, so with the immediately after the decision, they had to stop merging, not to stop. So I think they didn't stop voluntarily, and obviously they were waiting for, they fought back on the issue. I think the merging of the data, to some extent, they've been fined by the European Commission on this. And my sense is that that is probably as far as going to go on that particular issue. But now clearly the Supreme Court has overruled, so what if they have to merge the data to stop merging in Germany? Is that going potentially to affect their ability to operate there? So there is a question mark also on what then becomes a kind of, the commercial response. So I'll take I hope that answers the question. So I'll pass on to, there's a second question. Would you say that security regulation, e.g. Huawei, is also becoming a specific platform regulation? Huawei phone do not have access to Google services, etc. I think it's more of a political, I think there is a lot of you know, is more of a trade issue. That one, and I think will be solved with trade, through trade tools rather than any other type of tools. I don't think uh, yeah, I don't think anything else would work really. Then a third question from my my co-MEF colleague Rafael. How close is EU to actually regulate platform along 2021? Does the potential harm to competition amongst US non-regulated companies and EU regulated ones an argument to refrain regulators? So two questions in one. I'll take the first one. I'll break them down. So how close is the EU to actually regulate in 2021? No, but I don't think it's very close, realistically, because then even if you have they're going to use a regulation so that you can enter into force, but I think it will require the countries to agree and the parliament to agree. There will be a discussion on that. So I think we are not 2022 now look more realistically. However, what we could see in 2021 is the carve out of some areas and maybe some voluntary undertakings, or in effect operator agreeing to change voluntarily some of the practices to avoid regulation under pressure from that. So I think it's also, and in that respect, I think it's an interesting year, because one thing we have seen with the pandemic is particularly some players have come into play in terms of cooperating with government to fight the pandemic. And I think there's been some good example of cooperation there around very important societal benefits, which is public health in this case. So I think 2021 is the year where we are going to see probably a bit more of that kind of public-private cooperation, which, but also some voluntary change of behavior. So by the time regulation comes into force, I think we have to see where the market will be by then. And but I think in some area, if I have to choose an area, I think content moderation probably is the one where we'll see more urgent intervention. And then the second part, does the potential harm to competition among US non-regulated companies and EU regulated ones to refrain regulators? But I think it's tricky because it shouldn't be an argument. However, regulators are in some cases appointed by the politics, so they also are people. So I think they should, but they can. That's a reality. They shouldn't, but they, in some cases, that can be a thought. But I think, if you look historically, this is not the first time that you have a US versus EU situation. And I think that there's various fronts here. We have the situation in the airline industry now, Airbus versus the sanctions. And again, for me, there are some trade issues which pop up from time to time. Can be taxation, international taxation, but I think we should always be clear about using, what is the problem, what is the sector, and what is the legislation to address that. So I would not like to see competition policy becoming a tool of, to enforce, in effect, trade sanction or other type of discriminatory. I think if we are issue, and this is an issue not only with American companies, we have it, I think Europe has, potentially at times similar issue on the table with Chinese companies. if you think they're undermining, you can use state aid instruments to look into that. So I think, like in the case of Huawei, if you think there's special link, you can use. There are, some instruments to ask for greater transparency. So I think you should be always trying to use the right instrument that you are already available to make, to shed the lights and sort out issues. And then a final question, which when talking about regulation, is lawful interference included? I wasn't thinking that much about that, to be honest. I'm more thinking about the regulation of, in terms of consumer protection and competition, consumer and competition. So no more question. I think we can wrap up, really, which I think quite pleased. Snappy 30 minutes, which I think hopefully hasn't taken much of anybody's time, and I hope this was informative. Thanks for the questions, and thanks, and yeah, have a nice evening. Bye.